The internet has always been a monument of humanity's creativity and exploration, as much as it is a monument of our ignorance and misunderstanding. No better example is there than the late 90s to early 2000s internet, and no better way to experience that is there than through Tendershoot's Hypnospace Outlaw. Adrian and Dylan Merchant started a company in 1996 called Merchantsoft. Dylan's role was to create cutting-edge software to which his brother Adrian would then market to investors or sell to clients. Both brothers were met with extreme success in what they specialized in, as in under a year they were able to launch a browser with which the average person could create and browse web pages called NetSettler. While this wasn't particularly impressive by itself, since people could access the internet with the clients that existed already, this was the first one that was built with the average person in mind. You no longer needed to be a whiz kid to get on the internet. NetSettler was presumably again wildly successful, as in October of 1997, a revolutionary press conference was held wherein the Merchant Brothers and the Consumer Technology and Research Center showcased their new sleep time computing software, where you could now don a headset and interact with a computer as you would when you were awake, with the images being beamed directly into your brain as a dream. NetSettler worked as a community, as groups of people who had common interests could create zones where they interacted with one another. For example, if you were into games, you'd join a gaming zone, or if you were interested in rock music, you might join a rock music zone. Apparently, children were especially susceptible to predation in the days of NetSettler because of this organizational structure, but it's not apparent to me how exactly this would be the case. Nonetheless, in the near future with the release of Hypnospace, these community-created and supported zones would instead only be created and orchestrated by Merchantsoft in an effort to protect their more vulnerable users, as well as a few less admirable reasons such as pushing their brand partners' visibility and agendas and grouping problem groups together like conspiracy theorists and, surprisingly, gamers. We're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but just keep in mind that NetSettler had a lot more freedom and less bureaucracy than Hypnospace when it released. Speaking of the release of Hypnospace, and almost exactly a year from Merchantsoft's press conference, the Hypnospace bands were now market ready and were to hit the shelves November 1st of 1998. In the first 6 months on the market, Merchantsoft claims that over 2 million copies of Hypnospace were sold. However, a product recall notice towards the end of the game shows that just over 64,000 headbands were recalled nationwide after over a year and a quarter of sales, which is assumedly all the headbands sold. This isn't even 4% of the claimed units sold, which is wildly misrepresenting the success of their company to potential investors. This is only conjecture, but I wonder if Merchantsoft rolled out updates to NetSettler users who actually numbered in the millions and is just lumping together the sales of their headbands in those numbers. Again, it's only conjecture. Draw your own conclusions about how Merchantsoft could dodge legal repercussions for wildly misrepresenting their success. This isn't the first time that Merchantsoft would misrepresent the effort and success of their company in their promotional materials. A video claims that $1 billion went towards research and development of their sleep time computing software. Keep in mind that Hypnospace headbands cost about $500 each. If we multiply that by 64,000 headbands, we get squarely $32 million, which again doesn't even return 4% of the total investment. The only presumptions you could perhaps make are that partner brands, investors, and the Consumer Neurotechnology and Research Center shoulder the king's share of the cost with little expectation of returns, because of course, businesses are generally happy to take losses for no return. They're in it for the fun of the game, I think. Seriously though, something stinks in the way Merchantsoft comes to represent themselves to the public. There's a lot to be said for what ends up happening behind closed doors, which we'll talk about in due time, but for now, there's a lot of tricks on the surface they're pulling that shows shady business practices. Back to the weeks and months following the release of Hypnospace, people were by and large impressed with the ability to surf the web while they slept. To have a whole 8 hours of their day that they could now use to surf the web is impressive after all. Hypnospace, as described earlier, was now divided into dozens of zones where you could browse based on your interest. I wasn't able to find any information about how you got sorted into these zones as a general user, whether it was self-elective or you had to petition to be included in these zones isn't exactly clear. During the early days of Hypnospace, a few users with a bit more technical acumen than their average user founded an underground forum called Minx, where they could discuss ongoing Hypnospace drama without being harassed by Hypnospace mods and enforcers, and where they could come up with plans to mess with Merchantsoft at large with little harmless pranks and piracy and hacking of Merchantsoft software. Entry to this forum was itself hidden behind an all-seeing eye program that allowed users entry to the forum by uncovering hidden links by moving the eye over those hidden elements. Some of the stunts pulled by Minx users before the events of the game proper were an exploding headband prank, where Minx had more gullible users convinced that if they didn't put a particularly bad song on their personal page, then their headband would blow up. Minx had the technical and artistic skill to pull these feats off, as during the events of the game proper, Minx was actually able to create a game that users could play that was meant to further push their agenda of Counselor Ronnie. We'll talk about Counselor Ronnie in a bit, but for now let's acknowledge how impressive a feat making a game is. The Drug Runners game isn't particularly impressive in either looks or gameplay, but Dylan Merchant would go on to develop his own game later on in the timeline, and it takes him several months of work, and he has to work his fellow programmers and interns long hours just to release a simple car chasing game. Without spoiling too much more about Minx before it's relevant, just know that they're incredibly impressive in the things that they do, and they largely choose just to mess with Merchantsoft and their users instead of anything outright malicious. The year between the release of Hypnospace in-universe and when we start playing Hypnospace the game, a few interesting things happen that are worth noting here before we get started on the events of Hypnospace Outlaw proper. Firstly, Merchantsoft would partner creatively with Jan Wolf, the creator of the current music fad called Cool Punk. The original Cool Punk song that took off from Jan Wolf was a sample of Grey Peak Cola's jingle, so in an effort to revitalize their brand, Merchantsoft comes up with a marketing plan for Grey's Peak Cola, where they both partner with Jan Wolf, the creator of Cool Punk, and Chowder Man, a washed-up rock star who makes modern jingles for modern companies such as Granny Cream's Hot Butter Ice Cream. Along with this scheme comes an extremely commercialized new zone on Hypnospace called Cool Punk Paradise to push the Cool Punk genre and by extension push Grey's Peak Cola. A month before the events of the game, Merchantsoft would take issue with some of the more nerdy zones in Hypnospace. Well, to be specific, one merchant, Adrian, would take problem with 5 zones like Gamers Only, Sci-Fi Starport, and the Comic Shop, who apparently gave Hypnospace a reputation for being nerdy, and since this was a product for grandparents and children, this was a slight on Merchantsoft's marketing. Adrian's brother Dylan tries to get him to see reasons, since those 5 zones comprised a third of the Hypnospace user base, but Adrian wasn't willing to budge on this issue. The solution was to condense the 5 zones into one zone called the Starport Castle Dream Station, and to transfer all of their files from a previously faster server to a much slower one in preparation for the new Y2K update. So in summation, a third of Hypnospace were suddenly all clustered together in one place, and their connections were much slower on the whole. A popular music exchange forum on Hypnospace, the Digi Exchange, was also deleted at this time to avoid legal issues, but with this, Dylan Merchant and another Hypnospace techie, Gearhead Greg, would create the Flist directories. Flist is the new peer-to-peer file exchange where you can put an F and then the last 6 of a Hypnospace user's ID into a search bar, and it would return a personal repository of files that were then shareable to anybody else who had your headband ID. You could only access and create these Flists if you had a master password from one of the current Flist users. An important thing to note at this point is that Hypnospace isn't the only sleep time software available on the market. Hypnospace's small but direct competitor is called Cyberworlds, which has a much more friendly and receptive corporate atmosphere welcoming of all interests. The final thing to note before we get into the events of the game proper is the discontinuation of NetSettler support. Now, pages which had been running on NetSettler Page Builder for years were to be corrupted until the new year, when they'd be deleted if you didn't either use the Hypnospace Page Builder or pay for a temporary fix, HypnoCure Pro, for an exorbitant price. And again, this would only last until the new year, then it would become mandatory to switch to the new page builder. Having covered everything until then, let's now talk about the events of the game itself. The game opens on November 5th, 1999, with the player as a new Hypnospace enforcer, and after being introduced to how to play and how to act as an enforcer for Hypnospace, you're let loose into the internet to roam for infractions. The first of which is a number of copyright infringements for a cartoon character named Gumshoe Gooper. After deleting a number of Gumshoe Gooper infractions, your next case is a member who's been flagged for harassing other members named Zane Lofton. Again, you find proof of this on his Got Game or Way Lame page, and another case is handled easily. Your next case is against an extra-legal commerce program called Kappa Cash, which actually lets you use real currency to cash in and out. unlike HypnoCoin, which you can only purchase like a premium currency with no way to cash out. The first couple of cases are simple and uninteresting, so I'm going to take these cases to talk about what's happening around November 5th. An exciting new concert is announced to take place on November 20th called the Cool Fest, where Chowderman and Freezer will be co-hosting their greatest hits at a concert centered around cool punk. There's a lot of small things going on with everyone you'll run into Hypnospace, like Tiffany Wright, who shares her creativity for horror with stories and with her friends. One friend, Timothy Stevens, shows special proficiency with hacking and creating interactable experiences on Hypnospace. Another minor character making moves in Hypnospace is Roddy Wall, who has a number of helpful this and that pages on Hypnospace, explaining what some features are, like the launcher and the search function. It's important to mention that he's helping the current inhabitants of the Starport Castle Dream Station create their own area on Hypnospace, where they don't have to be afraid of being stymied by Merchantsoft again. This group also has access to a speed hack tool thanks to Roddy that allows their pages to load extremely fast once again. Before returning to the main events of the game, it's worth mentioning what Minx is up to at this time. Minx made a satirical character on Hypnospace called Counselor Ronnie, who gave awful advice tailored towards children and promoted hoaxes. A couple notable examples are T-Nubs, which are fake drug suppositories, means they go up your butt, that's ravaging schoolyards due to peer pressure. Beep Brain is another hoax Minx has orchestrated, where they claim the Hypnospace band's waves that they emit to your brain are instead cooking your brain. The Counselor Ronnie page actually wins Merchantsoft a grant from the government for being educational to children, however, completely untrue. Getting back to the cases you've been assigned, your next case is a special one, as several users' pages have been afflicted with a virus that was mass sent to every user of Hypnospace by Timothy Stevens. The virus flashes a shock image across your screen, is difficult to control without an antivirus, and for a few select users, it completely converts their pages into that same shock image. After hunting those users down yourself through Tim's riddles, you fix their pages and get an email from Dylan to all Hypnospace enforcers about beta testing a game he's developing for Hypnospace called Outlaw. Outlaw eventually becomes a game where you catch criminals with a cyber lasso, but here on November 5th, it's a little less than optimal and crashes nearly every Hypnospace enforcer's headband. Merchantsoft ships out functional headbands to the users affected, and you're able to return to Hypnospace on November 26th. Your return to Hypnospace isn't all that grand though, as with most enforcers being out of commission at this time, infractions across Hypnospace have run rampant. These cases are lumped together in-game as you travel pages and search for any infractions you can find, so I'm going to again go over some general happenings in the world of Hypnospace. Returning to Cool Fest 99, we find out that the event was a total tragedy. Freezer was caught lip-syncing his signature song Icy Girl instead of singing it. Then Grey Peak had promised attendees free Icy Cola, but when people got there they found that it cost $5 instead. Finally, and most tragically of all, there was a malfunction with Chowderman's helicopter, and the band's drummer was killed, and several people, both band members and audience members, were injured, with Chowderman even losing a leg. The concert was held with the hopes that around 5,000 people would show up, but instead only about 200 did, with patrons being severely disgusted with conduct therein, and then, with several being injured, the concert was declared as big a failure as it could have been. In the days leading up to the 26th of November, Ice Peaks Cola would get cold feet about being a partner brand of Hypnospace, and in the days following November 26th, they'd pull out as a partner. At the same time, Dylan starts to finally lose his patience with a new hire named Samantha, who was a very talented Hypnospace developer who created HypnoCure. Samantha constantly would rebuff Dylan's wasting of resources on his game, citing the need to fix actual bugs and problems with Hypnospace. Dylan's response to this was to again state the importance of the game to himself, and then he rushed to Minx's forum, of which he's now a member of, and baits members to harass her. Thankfully, an unfruitful endeavor. Dylan then just reassigned Samantha to enforcement, taking her off of development. The Merchant brothers at this time were both becoming wildly more and more unhinged. Adrian began indulging more and more in New Age meditation for guidance in his business dealings, an indulgence his friend and co-worker Artie Dispenza was all too happy to steer him towards, being a free spirit himself. Adrian oftentimes consulted with and sought comfort in Artie, as they weren't just spiritual brothers, but were also members of the same secret Children of Horus society. We'll talk about this again near the end game, but for now just know that Adrian is losing his mind and his colleague Artie is helping him none. The other brother, Dylan, again is losing himself in his effort to complete Outlaw in time for a year 2000 release. Dylan begins overworking his friends and underlings, pushing away anyone who challenges his mindset in the least bit. Roddy, not at this time but in the near future, would be fired from Merchantsoft, likely from one of these bouts of ideology between him and Dylan, in conjunction with the events of our next case. The next case is finding a speed accelerator program being downloaded from somewhere in the Starport Castle Dream Station. When you visit this zone, however, you notice it fairly empty, with most of the pages pointing you towards a single mini-zone called the Sovereign Alliance of Imagination, which you're able to actually click on and explore. Instead of very evident web pages, you explore the Skylands like a world by clicking on road signs and visiting pages by clicking on landmarks. In one of these landmarks, you find the Trial of Acceleration, which promises a great reward, the implication being faster load times if you complete the trial. Visiting the members' landmarks and completing the trial in its entirety, you're now privy to Roddy's speed hack software and report it to your bosses at the Hypnospace Enforcement PD. They then give you your final case of November, which is to find where users are sharing illegal downloads of copyrighted music. This leads you on a rabbit hole of technological doodads, but you eventually make your way to the Fliss pages, where you find the Fliss page of a very popular music share called DM Noise Pusher. And when you go to report his music sharing to the Hypnospace Enforcement HQ, you get a personal email from Dylan himself making you aware that you just reported him and you're now being taken off of enforcer duty indefinitely. Indefinitely turns out to be until December 31st, mere hours before Merchantsoft's new Y2K Hypnospace is unveiled. Unfortunately for everyone, Teentopia is held hostage by a virus from Timothy Stevens called the Mind Crash virus, threatening to destroy Hypnospace if someone special doesn't involve themselves. This is our only case of December 31st, so let me go again over some of the happenings until now. Freeze Peaks Cola pulls their partnership with Merchantsoft, and it's instead replaced with a new partner brand called Stick Bricks. The Sovereign Alliance of Imagination's web pages and the Freelens were corrupted by Merchantsoft, so those users finally packed up and moved to Hypnospace's competitor, Cyberworlds. Merchantsoft half-heartedly apologizes for this mistake to their lost user base, but it's for naught. The most important breakthrough is in an effort to abate the Beef Brain hoax, Merchantsoft commissioned a private study into their Hypnospace headbands, and while Beef Brain was confirmed to be unfounded, what was revealed in the very short study was that the headbands were in the short term extremely unhealthy, not to mention what might have been revealed if a longer sleep study were to be conducted. Merchantsoft then buried this report, but people across Hypnospace were also expressing how tired the Hypnospace headbands were making them. A Minx user would compile these studies and publish them publicly for other users to see, but these were caught by enforcers quick enough, firstly, and secondly they were drowned out by Tim's Mind Crash virus. Back to that virus, you find that the password to stop the Mind Crash virus is the nickname he gave to the girl he was interested at the time, Tiffany, or Marshmallow. You shut down the Mind Crash virus and return Teentopia to normal. But only moments later, an update is pushed to every Hypnoband user with the Outlaw 0.99 update, which would violently crash headbands all across the US. The player thankfully is only woken up with a start, but a news broadcast reveals that between 4 and 6 users were killed, depending on the player's actions, and 340 injured during the crash, being dubbed the Mind Crash and blamed on Timothy Stevens, who would become the first juvenile charged with manslaughter by way of computer hacking. He is then sentenced to prison for 6 years. We're going to go through each user killed or killable one at a time to explore their vulnerabilities leading to their death. Dark Twilight Tiff, or Tiffany, was a young girl who used to be plagued with seizures, but hadn't had one in a long time. This sensitivity is likely what led to her death on January 1st. The next person to die was Mavis Ann Green, who was an old lady living in an assisted living facility where she used her Hypnospace headband just about once a week because it made her so sleepy. Mavis's age, mixed with how tired Hypnospace made her anyways, likely led to her death. Rodney Hooks was the third victim and is the only user that I can't find evidence that makes me confident it led to their death.
Hold it. Dr. Dirk here from the editing room with a supplemental. So I looked into it, and there's an implication that Rodney participated in the Y2K Sleep Time Challenge, where you'd sleep for a prolonged amount of time in Hypnospace. We'll cover the challenge more in depth in just a minute, but this seems to be the cause for Rodney's death, which was not what I had thought in the original take of this part. Back to the video.
He wasn't especially old, but he did seem to be pretty strongly anti-government. Maybe this paranoia led to unrestful sleep? You'll have to forgive me, but this is the only character I'm not sure of their sensitivities leading to death. The fourth victim was Carl Parker III, who was simply especially old once again. The fifth victim was Dylan's good friend Roddy Wall, who had been overworked immensely to launch Outlaw to the public in time for the Y2K update. This overwork, mixed with his frequent use of hypnospace and stress over the side drama and being fired, likely led to his death. The final and most unique death to me was Zane Lofton. We actually have to dip into the extended universe on the Zane Lofton Twitter for this answer. Minx had a hoax contest supposedly held by Merchantsoft where users were competing with one another to see who could sleep the longest for $100,000, being dubbed the Y2000 Sleep Time Challenge. Zane himself was on hour 96 at least by the time he was banned, and the mind crash virus would have happened. This overuse was likely wildly unhealthy and is what led to his potential death. The story proper picks back up in the modern day, whatever day you choose to play the game, where you're now a member of the Hypnospace Archival Project, or HAP, which is being ran and funded by Tamara Frost and her benefactors to archive Hypnospace. There are a lot of interesting members of HAP, including Tamara, Artie, Timothy Stevens, and Samantha, under the fake name Chelsea. The Hypnospace Archival Project's role was to archive all the old pages from every member's time on Hypnospace, as the bands double as a backup server. A Lost and Found page is created for people to hunt down missing media from 1999. Some of this media includes a test pet by Roddy, an early song made by now hit rapper Kevin, the lyrics for a Chowder Man song written after his accident, and a potential quest where you find the last coordinates of a submarine searching for lost treasure. The last media is in finding an eye cult. This eventually leads you to the Children of Horus page, and upon logging in, it's revealed it's a secret society dedicated to hiding the Eye of Horus in popular media, like Squishers, Hypnospace itself, and travel guides. Adrian Merchant and Artie Dispenza were both members of this eye cult, and Chowderman himself used to be a member until he was disqualified for what's called Rule 2, which is referencing the Children of Horus by name. I personally was particularly invested in the Children of Horus, but I'm fairly certain there's not much more to read into them, other than that they're a bunch of famous people who shoehorn Horus imagery into popular media to compete with each other. Then, at the end of the competition, they hold a banquet for themselves to celebrate another successful year, and that's all to them. After completing several of these Lost and Found projects, you're personally messaged by Chelsea, or Samantha, asking you for help finding evidence that incriminates Merchantsoft in the Y2K mine crash. You search the Minx forums, the FLIST file lists, and archives of old pages, and finally find the proof needed to bring Merchantsoft's dark dealings to light. And just as soon as Dylan joins the Hypnospace Archival team and is set to be outed, he immediately sends his completed 1.0 Outlaw game to the player, where after completing game objectives and winning Outlaw, you get a personal apology to each person killed by the mine crash and a statement of guilt, along with the promise that Dylan would not resist authorities. And that's all there is to Hypnospace Outlaw. I had a lot of fun playing this game, and I'm really looking forward to the next game that's coming soon called Dream Settler. You can find the Steam page for it in the description. It's not out yet, but definitely wishlist it, and if it is out by the time that you're watching this, maybe give it a try. See you guys in the next video. Later!